going to get started. This is OWASP Top 10 2021. So a little bit about me. I've been a software developer for the better part of a decade, and I like to think I've been developing for the same company. That's not true. I've been developing for the same product line, and when I first started, security was not at the top of anyone's mind. But as the company grew and we got more users, security became a bigger and bigger concern. And so the OWASP Top 10 has become a sort of starting ground for secure development and a secure life cycle in the company. So about the OWASP Top 10, I put this slide here because just to give you an idea of how long OWASP has been around. The first release was in 2003, and the last release last year, 2021, was only the 7th release. And to give you an idea how long ago that was, Chrome was released in 2008, the iPhone in 2007, Azure in 2008, AWS in 2006, and even modern software tools that we take for granted is Git in 2005. So the OWASP has been around since 2003. To give you an idea of just how long it's been around. And so why doesn't OWASP Top 10 update more often? Well, the OWASP Top 10 has become sort of a de facto pseudo standard to say, and companies use it as a training source. And so it would be hard to adopt training for the OWASP Top 10 if it was a constantly moving target. So the update cadence has generally been around every 3 years. So what is the OWASP Top 10? Well, it's targeted at developers, architects, security professionals. One of the biggest challenges to comprehensive security is figuring out how to engage multiple disciplines, all the way from designing the system, with your architects developing the system, and then also your system operations. And so it's very important to keep everyone engaged. There just aren't enough app security professionals in the field. So we have to empower and support our developers. A lot of us who are developers, we already have a lot of stuff that's expected of us to know in detail. So security is probably not at the top of anyone's minds. The OWASP Top 10 is the 10 most critical risks identified in web applications. It's not solely indicative of the likelihood or the impact of those risks. The likelihood or impact of the vulnerability, it's a combination of both the impact of the vulnerability and the likelihood of it. There should be an asterisk that this is also just the top 10. It could be the top 20, the top 100. There are many more vulnerabilities than just 10. The OWASP Top 10 was built as a data-driven awareness document, but the truth is it's also become sort of closer to a pseudo standard. And the people who create the list are aware of that and keep that in mind. This was actually supposed to be the OWASP Top 10 2020, but it was delayed until 2021. So the top 10 is determined in 2 parts. The first 8 are data collected by data that is aggregated voluntarily by companies and organizations. The data is voluntarily collected by 13 companies and organizations. They have the greater than half a million applications worth of vulnerability data, and more than 400 unique CWEs, which are common weakness enumerations. The data points are aggregated to determine the incident rate per CWE, and then those are ordered based on the number. The second part of the top 10 is determined by survey question. So the survey question is included to to ask the question, what do you believe should be in the top 10 that is not likely to show up in the vulnerability data? And so the reason they include this is that there will always be some vulnerabilities that are either just too new or too hard to test for, and it makes them unlikely to show up in the data. Data by nature is historical. It's not predicted of the future trends. Hence, 8 of the top 10 were data-driven, and 2 were chosen based off the survey. Whether they're actually a bigger deal than what the data shows, or they're just hard to find, is to be determined. So they order from 1 to 10. There is a key here. Anything that is green is new for 2021. Anything that is bold is in response to the data collected, and anything that is highlighted, anything that is in italics, was added because of the survey responses. So although they are ordered from 1 to 10, I would emphasize that the order of the list is not as important as being aware of them. There are hundreds of vulnerabilities. So all the top 10 most common are going to be of roughly equal importance. If you zoom out a bit, all 10 of them are going to be something to keep in mind. And so, just by the nature of being a top 10 list, it is an incomplete list, since it could be, there could be hundreds of items. So we'll start with the first one, which is broken access control. So unlike the slang term A1 that you might be familiar with, A1 in this scenario does not mean it's good. Most of the largest breaches involve broken access control. It's just one of the more difficult vulnerabilities to fix because there's just not one way to fix them. So broken access control can include unauthorized access to accounts, bypassing access control checks to the access control checks, or the access control checks do not exist. Parameter tampering, which is modifying the URL, modifying the internal application state. It can include unauthorized elevation of privilege, either acting as a user without being logged in, or as a user acting with admin privileges while only being logged in as a user. This can lead to unauthorized, create, read, update, delete operations. Broken access control can also include JOT or cookie tampering. A lot of web APIs use JOTs, JSON web tokens, and a lot of websites use cookies. So JOTs are base64 encoded strings. And they include a header, a payload, and a signature. They're often, it is signed so that you know that the payload is not tampered with. So it's important to make sure that that your JOTs are always valid. Storing JOTs in local storage, which is common for web applications, leaves you vulnerable to cross-site scripting attacks. Cookies, on the other hand, are sent with every request. JOTs are sent in the header. Cookies, though, are sent with every request, which makes them vulnerable to CSRF attacks. So there's also CORS misconfigurations, allowing API access from unauthorized, untrusted sources. So there are a few principles to keep in mind, or recommendations to deal with broken access control. First is the principle of complete mediation. Every request to access object should be checked to ensure that they are allowed, or in other words, mediated. Not just the first time you request access to an API, but every check, even not just external checks either, but also internal checks between your services should also be mediated. There's a principle of least privilege, or also, or sometimes called denied by default. So this applies not only to users of the application, but also to the application itself, and what access they're given to databases, data, and other services. So just as an example, it's very common. It's very common for apps to need access to a database, but it's very unlikely that app needs say, database owner role or too many roles to a database. And so that would be an example of breaking the principle of least privilege. So you also want to just minimize your cores usage. The less cores you enable, the less likely it's going to be misconfigured. The second part of the OWASP top 10 is cryptographic failures. This can be, because of ineffective or missing data at rest encryption. You could be using bad keys, bad ciphers, bad cryptographic functions. As a reminder, base 64 encoding is not encryption. It could be ineffective or missing TLS. You should consider anything before TLS 1.2 to be deprecated, and all SSL deprecated. When someone says SSL, they are usually referring to TLS. It's just that the branding of SSL has stuck around for too long. And always ensure that HTTPS directives are enabled so that the site is only reachable over TLS. This could also include another cryptographic failure could also include ineffective or missing password hashing, storing plain text passwords in the database, not using a non-cryptographic hash function when you should be using a cryptographic hash function. There are certain hash algorithms known to be good password hash functions that you should be using, and you should always be using one of those. There are also ineffective, there's certain recommendations to deal with these cryptographic failures. One way is HTTP strict transport security header, or HSTS. And so this instructs the browser to only access the site by HTTPS. Keep in mind that this is only a header. It's only a browser instruction. Other consumers, if you have an API, other consumers of the API might not obey that instruction. The only way to really enforce HTTPS is to configure your applications to only listen and respond to HTTPS. So it is 2022, and so I don't know if there's any excuse to not be using HTTPS. A defense against cryptographic failures is defense in depth, and that's kind of what those circles are. So you start with your data, and then you put a layer of encryption over it, and then the next layer would be, say, your access control policy, and maybe you have them logging on top of that. Then you have your transport encryption, which is TLS, and then maybe you have some honeypots to distract hackers. And so only an authenticated identity should have access to permissions to decrypt your data. Even in this case where if your access control is broken, having the data encrypted provides that extra protection. Your honeypots lure attackers, with purposely vulnerable, with purposefully vulnerable data, and then you can log in and find if someone's in your system. And so if one of these layers were to be breached, there's another layer protecting your data. And always classify your data processed. Identify which data is sensitive according to privacy laws and regulations requirements. And once you've identified any sensitive data and risks, you can build your trust models and prioritize what your threats are. There's one more type of defense in cryptography that's called application level encryption, ALE. And so typically, your app looks something like the first couple boxes, where you send data, it's encrypted over TLS. Maybe you have a second app that receives that request and forwards it to a third app. But sometimes if you have particularly sensitive data, you can encrypt it. You can encrypt a part of that message within the application itself. And so what application level encryption does is it moves the boundaries of your encryption to within the application itself. So although it's sent from app 1 to app 3, App 2 can't read what that message is. 3 is injection. So this is the first year since 2010 that injection is not number 1. And this can mainly be attributed to improved frameworks, led to a huge decline in injection. But when people think of injection, it's not just SQL injection. It can also be LDAP injection or cross-site scripting. Cross-site scripting is really a type of injection where you inject code into a web page. And so on that, cross-site scripting used to be actually its own category. In 2017, it was number 7. This year, they included cross-site scripting in with injection itself. So that's part of a broader topic where this year in 2021, they try to take broader topics and put them all into one. They try to deal with root causes and not just symptoms. So the root cause is injection. Cross-site scripting is just a type of injection. So always make sure that you validate, sanitize, escape any data that crosses trust boundaries. Any input you get from a client, any input you receive from another API. Use frameworks that assemble your HTML safely. You know, a lot of frameworks will handle this for you these days. Cross-site scripting is also one of the easier vulnerabilities to fix because of these improved frameworks. And that's one of the reasons it was combined into injection. Do simple input validation. Validate your file contents. Make sure your file contents that you receive match their file extensions. Validate that the content types. If you expect JSON, make sure that you are receiving JSON. If you expect a text input, make sure you're receiving text. And so this is an example of injection. At the top, there's a long regex. That's actually in an RFC 5322 compliant email regex. It's an email standard that describes the basic format for an email message. So the next line is actually a valid email address, and I didn't come up. And so the quotes and the exclamation mark and the equals, those are actually valid characters in an email address. I didn't come up with this idea of injection through email. This is actually an example stolen from Jim Manicode, who's one of the core maintainers of the OWASP top 10. So although this is a valid input, you should still always sanitize and validate your input. Even though you expect it to be, even though it follows the standards, doesn't always mean that it's safe. And so here, if you were to put that email into the select statement, you could select all from table where email equals mat, and then or 1 does not equal Sheehan codes, which would always be true. And so they'd always get the data returned back to them. So the next is insecure design. The difference, this is one of the new categories in 2021. And it's slightly controversial because how do you define secure design or insecure design? But if you think about it, if you want to build the house of your dreams, you don't immediately start laying the bricks before collecting your requirements for what your home needs. And once you have the requirements, you don't start building then before talking to an architect. And so the difference between an insecure design and an insecure implementation is that one is a design flaw and the other is just a security bug. So a secure design can still have implementation defects, but an insecure design cannot be fixed even with perfect implementation, just by the definition of it being an insecure design. So it's a difference between a simple security bug that can be fixed later and a complete design flaw. So an insecure design is costly to fix up front, but it's going to be costlier to fix later down the line. It requires considering security before the code is written. Security is often overlooked since it's considered one of the non-functional requirements of software. Your functional requirements are usually things that, like the features, and your non-functional requirements are things like, availability, scalability, reliability, testability, and security. Secure design cannot be bolted on later. Secure by design means software that has been designed from the ground up to be secure. It requires a holistic systems approach versus a component analysis. It requires a top-down decomposition from your business objectives. It requires you to have a good visualization, of what your architecture is, since it's hard to secure what you can't understand. So you need to do threat modeling, secure reference, refer to secure reference architectures. So every time you design a system, you cannot start from a clean slate. There have to be some basic immutable principles, which is where reference architectures come in, secure reference architectures. And you also need to understand the areas where all your key flows, so you can appropriately know what your threats are. Key flows are how your authentication works, how your access control works, and important flows for business logic. Establishing a secure development lifecycle. This goes beyond just shifting left. It also includes making sure that you're using secured component libraries, making paved road libraries that are secure for other developers to use. Come up with what your security guiding principles are. Separation of privilege, least privilege, defense in depth. You need to make sure you use unit testing and integration tests. Validate that to validate that your critical paths are resistant to your threat model. So the next one is security misconfiguration. There's actually been an increase. Infrastructure as code, with the rise in popularity of infrastructure as code, there has actually been an increase in security misconfigurations. But that's actually a good thing, because it means that we're catching more security misconfigurations. Before infrastructure as code, there were still security misconfigurations. There just wasn't tooling that could statically or dynamically analyze the infrastructure. So infrastructure as code has given us that capability. Improper configurations on cloud services, missing security hardening. So, this is making sure that your security settings in the application are not misconfigured. Don't be using your default accounts or default passwords. Check that your apps are running. Check that your apps are not running on non-standard ports that don't have security policies applied to them. Check that checking that apps aren't running with overly verbose logging. And there are a lot of challenges with security misconfigurations, especially with the cloud these days. Keeping up with the latest, public cloud provider changes. Every week, if you work with Azure or AWS, every week there is something new, and not just every week, but sometimes it's every day, or something is coming in, something new is in preview, or something is coming out of preview, and so there's just a lot to keep up with the cloud development. And also, security is an emergent property of systems, and so it requires multiple disciplines, which attributes to the rise of DevOps. So it's no longer just developers writing code and operations keeping it stable, and IT responsible for making it secure. It really requires a multidisciplinary and a more holistic approach. So how do we catch security misconfigurations? Well, we can use static code analysis tools, creating paved roads for development, libraries that we know are safe and secure for developers to use. We can use code reviews. Infrastructure as code brings the development best practices to IT and operations. And the number one thing that most people can probably do is just read the documentation. If you want to learn the proper settings to configure something, you have to read the manual. There's a lot of documentation on how to configure your applications, how to harden your applications, how to keep your applications secure, especially with cloud development. So the next one is using vulnerable and outdated components. So this would, if the OWASP top 10 was decided in 2022, this would probably be the #1 vulnerability after the recent Log4Shell, Log4j vulnerability that allow for arbitrary code execution. So modern software includes a lot of external code as well, and that includes OS, runtimes, libraries. We live in a time where OS patches should be happening regularly, not just monthly or quarterly or whenever IT can get around to it. So not upgrading your dependencies in a risk-based or timely fashion. Continuously monitor for outdated components. There are tools that will help you do this. GitHub Dependabot, dependency checking for OWASP dependency check for continuously monitoring for vulnerabilities. So you need to know, there's some recommendations. Know the versions of all the components you use and indirectly use. Minimize your attack surface, remove your unused dependencies, obtain packages from official sources and ensure that they're signed. Use CI/CD tools to warn for outdated components. Like I mentioned, GitHub Dependabot or OWASP dependency check. Continuously monitoring for vulnerabilities. So a recent breach that everyone's probably, it happened in 2017 that affected everyone was the Equifax breach. And this can be attributed to vulnerable and outdated components. They had a third-party software exploit that had a known patch already fixed for it, but Equifax failed to update their servers with a newer version, so it affected half the American population. I think it was 147 million. So when you reach those kind of numbers, you should probably update your packages. So identification and authorization failures. So 61% of breaches involve credentials, and 80% of hacking attempts involve credentials. And so these are two pictures from the Verizon 2021 data breach investigations report, which is a really good report that Verizon puts out every year for the in regards to breaches and vulnerabilities. So the way Verizon report determines the difference between a breach and a vulnerability, a breach and an incident, is a breach is the confirmed disclosure of data, and an incident is just a security event that could potentially compromise the system. So as I said before, so 61% of breaches involve some type of credentials. And most hacking attempts involve the use of credentials. So what is identification and authorization failures? Well, it's permitting weak or well-known passwords. So all passwords should be salted and hashed in one way. Passwords should not be encrypted. They should always be hashed. Encryption goes two ways. So hashing goes one way. And so by hashing it, it can never be decrypted. It's permitting brute force attacks or credential stuffing. Credential stuffing is where credential stuffing is using existing usernames and passwords and combinations used in credential dumps, which are leaked credentials that are easily acquired from previous exploits. Credential stuffing is more effective than brute force attacks, since they are known usernames and passwords, and a lot of people do reuse their usernames and passwords. Insecure password recovery. How many times do you log into a site and you forget your password, and so it asks you what street did you grow up on, what was your pet's name. But these are all things that can be easily figured out if someone knows you or can Google you. Numeration attacks. And so ensure that registration, credential recovery, and API pathways are hardened. Use the same messages for all outcomes. Enumeration attacks is consistently changing the username and password to find out users in your system. Follow the best practice. Always follow the best practices for passwords and rate limiting logins. So the last time I looked it up, the best practice for rate limiting was 10 failed login attempts in under a minute, or 100 failed login attempts in 24 hours. Use multi-factor authentication where possible. So MFA is good for prevention of credential stuffing or brute force attacks. Preferably, also use an authenticator app as a two-step authentication, not just SMS. SMS is susceptible to SMS spoofing. According to Microsoft, MFA is an effective strategy for preventing 99% of brute force type attacks. So why is access control number one, broken access control number one, but broken authorization number 7? But it's because frameworks that handle the authorization have improved over the years, but it's not possible for those frameworks to understand your access control policy. So your access control policies are usually customized, usually involve some business layer, much more manual and harder to standardize. So broken access control is a much more common vulnerability, making it number one, whereas authorization is a much easier problem to solve. Also, always validate, that your authentication and authorization for every request, that shouldn't be a public endpoint. That goes back to the idea of principle of complete mediation, making sure that every request, every time, is authorized, and don't trust that it's already been authorized. So number 8 is software and data integrity failures. This is something that came across my feed the other day, a couple weeks ago, and I thought it was interesting. And so this article talks about NPM, an NPM package that a developer released, as like a sabotage for users in Russia. But you think about how easy it would be for this to happen to any package. It's sort of crazy that the entire NPM, or the entire software supply chain is basically the promise that nothing malicious will ever get uploaded. And so, software and data integrity failures. This includes, not using plugins or libraries from untrusted sources. I'm mostly thinking about JavaScript developers, downloading libraries from NPM. Downloading untrusted sources is basically the entire security model of NPM. So make sure that you know what your dependencies are before you just include packages. Always verify your software and data is from trusted sources. If it's a signed package, verify the digital signatures. Verify that your components are not using known or do not contain known vulnerable dependencies. Once again, OWASP dependency check. There are a few other projects that operate as sort of a bill of materials so that you know what your dependencies are and what your inventory of libraries and frameworks being used is as well. CI/CD pipelines, without commit or build checks. This is what happened with the SolarWinds attack in 2020. So what happened was hackers broke into the SolarWinds, injected malicious code as part of the build process for their IT software that was distributed to customers as part of an automatic update. And this particular hack was a particularly big deal because it involved the U.S. government. The U.S. government used the SolarWinds software. And so in the end, it ultimately resulted in sanctions against Russia. But it was not just a failure of software integrity, but it was also a failure of logging and monitoring. The hackers were in the SolarWinds system for more than a year before anybody noticed it. They had done test injection trials a year before. It became a major national security issue because of a breach in the CI/CD pipeline. So always make sure that you have the proper configurations and the proper access controls. So one thing this year that's not included in the top 10 is insecure deserialization. Insecure deserialization. That is also that is included as part of a data integrity failure. So you probably already know this, but programming languages allow you to send JSON and receive JSON. So if you receive and deserialize a string from an untrusted source, make sure that it doesn't allow objects to be created or code to be executed. So number 9 is security logging and monitoring failures. So attackers, they rely on insufficient logging and monitoring to achieve their goals before being detected. Logging is a simple idea that is difficult to implement. It requires significant commitment, complexity, involves significant cost, involves significant operational support. And there are a lot of challenges, including tooling, culture, budget, or training. For example, if you use static code analysis tools, you can't find the absence of something. So static code analysis tools will not help you find the absence of sufficient logging. Or if you have a culture of just not logging enough, or you don't want to spend the budget since logging has to be stored somewhere. But logging is necessary for if you have breached disclosure laws or if you intend to prosecute, you need to make sure you have the logs. The average time to identify a breach is 280 days, and usually security vulnerabilities or breaches are found from outside the company, not even from the logging or monitoring. Usually it's someone that calls in, reports a fraudulent transaction, and then they realize that they were breached. And so there are a few recommendations. Using a centralized append-only login and monitoring storing. It's difficult to implement a centralized monitoring store without taking a multidisciplinary approach. So you have to it's hard to get your developers to care about security if they're existing in their bubble and the QA is existing in their bubble and the operations is in their bubble. And so developers have a lot of pressure to build new features, improve the quality, increase performance, make things more scalable. And so you need to get a developer's attention when security is constant. So you have to bring logging to developers' attention. Also, with having a centralized monitoring store, you should need to be aware of what becomes the honeypot database. So the honeypot database is putting all of your information or anything that's important, anything an attacker might want or might find useful that becomes the one database that everybody wants to get into. It's the centralized. If you can get in there, you can get in anywhere. So, logging is not just enough. You also have to have monitoring. So, enable automatic alerting for suspicious activity, audit trails for logins, access failures, anything that's of high value. Have good data hygiene across sources, and also expire the data when it's not needed anymore. You don't have to worry about data being breached if you just don't keep it beyond its useful lifetime. And so, what should you log? Well, you should log any input validation failures, invalid parameter names, invalid protocol, output validation failures, because of a database record mismatch. You should always log authentication failures and also authentication successes, application errors, when your application starts up, shuts down, any configuration changes. Make sure you have logging on any high-risk functions, all access control events, deleting users, anytime privileges are assigned, all actions by administrative users, any data imports or data exports. But there are also some things you probably should not log. Any PHI or PII, any type of access token or session ID, connection strings, encryption keys or secrets. It's important not to log anything that if a word breach would be useful to an attacker. And I do want to bring note that the URL at the bottom is the OWASP cheat sheet for logging. OWASP has a cheat sheet series. It's one of the projects, and in this particular case, their cheat sheet for logging is particularly good, and it lays out a logging message standard that could be implemented directly as it's written. It's a really great project. So number 10 is server-side request forgery. So server-side request forgery is sort of the back-end version of cross-site request forgery. So instead of the browser performing some unwanted request in an authenticated state, it's using the server's permissions instead. And Capital One is a really great example of this type of breach. So in 2019, there was a Capital One breach that compromised tons of data, and one of the vulnerabilities was because of the server-side request forgery. And it's also, the Capital One breach is also, as I mentioned earlier, the last two of the OWASP top 10 were added because of the survey responses. And so the Capital One breach is, in my opinion, one of the reasons that server-side request forgery made the top 10 list because it was such a high-profile breach. So Capital One had their servers hosted on AWS, and in AWS there's an endpoint that is private within AWS, but it's accessible to every service inside AWS and only AWS. And that endpoint was a metadata URL that returns information about the resource to itself. And so Capital One had a virtual machine that accepted a URL as a parameter, and then it used that URL to redirect traffic back to other services. So the hackers knew that Capital One VM was hosted in AWS, and they replaced the URL parameter with the URL parameter of the metadata URL. And so when the virtual machine got that parameter, it redirected the request to the metadata endpoint within AWS and returned that back to the hackers, and which they realized that that VM was allocated with excessive privileges and permissions to blob storage, and they were able to use those permissions of the VM to download a bunch of S3 buckets that they had. So generally, you should avoid taking URLs as parameters that the server then acts on. If you have to use URLs as parameters, you should try to build safe URLs using URL encoding. You should also always limit services with network controls and access controls. Generally, you want to try to use two types of authentication, some type of network control and some type of identity access control. So you want to restrict outgoing access on web servers, restrict incoming access on internal servers. You want to use a zero trust architecture. So the traditional way that security has been done is perimeter security, in which you make sure that the perimeter of your system is secure, but the internals is not, that doesn't necessarily have the same security checks on it. So all a hacker has to do is breach your perimeter, and then they have access to all of your resources. So perimeter security is just not sufficient. You want to avoid taking, like I said, avoid taking URLs as full parameters that the server acts upon, and make sure you build safe URLs with URL encoding of parameters. So what is the next steps? So it's important to remember that security is a process, not a product. And security is always going to be a moving target. So kind of like the owl drawing an owl, there are a lot of intermediate steps that are not listed anywhere, and you're never going to get to a finished product. There's a few challenges in security. Security doesn't, best case scenario, security prevents the business losing money down the road, potentially, saves in potential losses. But security is not a money maker. It's hard to engage developers and adopt a security mindset. Forcing security on people, on your developers, on employees does not work. So you can't dictate security from above. You have to train and adopt a security mindset. And it requires everyone to take ownership of security themselves. It requires secure coding, sometimes called defensive coding, and assumes that defensive coding assumes that users are not going to use the application in a way it's not intended. So there are a few other OWASP projects that I would like to bring to everyone's attention. Is OWASP SAM, OWASP Proactive Controls, OWASP ASVS. ASVS is an actual standard that is laid out by OWASP it can actually be implemented for your organization. OWASP Top 10 is just an awareness document, not meant as a standard, whereas OWASP ASVS is designed to be a comprehensive standard. And then there's some additional links that might be helpful. So, any questions?
You have one on Slack. If you had to rate which security concern is the hardest or most expensive to fix, which would it be, and which is the easiest or cheapest to fix?
So the question was, which security concern is the hardest or cheapest to fix? Hardest or most expensive to fix? And which one is the easiest or cheapest to fix? Well, I would say cross-site scripting is probably the easiest to fix because of frameworks. As far as the improved frameworks, if you're using modern frameworks, it's a lot of that is handled for you automatically. So just making sure it's part of keeping your dependencies up to date and making sure that you're using not outdated components. But I would say the hardest or cheapest, the most expensive to fix is going to be an insecure design. And so, because it requires a more just completely holistic approach. If your whole design of your software is insecure, you can't just patch one piece of it. A developer can't just write some code that will fix it. It requires a lot of forethought and a lot of rethinking of your security. This is one. Yeah.
When talking about data classification, are you aware of any frameworks that help in that goal, and maybe integrations to determine what correct levels of logging are when talking about data classification?
So the question was, for data classification or data encryption, data classification, are there any frameworks that will help you classify your data? And what was the second part of your question?
Are there any ties into a logging framework so that you know you have appropriate levels of logging?
Yeah. So I think data classification and making sure that you're having appropriate logging is just a difficult problem because you can't detect if you don't have logging. You can't implement a logging feature that says you don't have enough logging, or you can't implement a static code analysis tool that will scan your code and say you don't have enough logging, or there isn't a static code analysis tool that says what your data classification might be, because it depends on your business needs. So do I know of any tool? I do not. And I don't know of a good way to that'll automatically classify your data or log that data.
Sounds like opportunity.
Yeah, go ahead.
How about trying to design around the implicit trust of using the public cloud and all of their underlying machines and networking that it has to rely upon?
Yeah, so the question was how do you design around the trust required for the public clouds? And I think that just requires a secure architecture. One of the principles of secure architecture is having a zero trust architecture. Is just not assuming that nothing really can be trusted. There are a lot of best practices, whether you're using Azure or AWS, that you can implement. There's a lot of documentation on all those public clouds, but it really requires, I think it requires using a secure architecture, a secure reference architecture. Azure provides secure reference architectures if you're using Azure as a public cloud, and I'm sure AWS does the same. It's just I'm not sure if that answers your question. I don't think there's any more questions, so thank you for your time.